Welcome to a special episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. In today's episode, I'm joined by Orlando Throsby, who is a participant in the Menzies Early Career Network. The network offers university students around Australia an opportunity to engage with the history of the Menzies era, connect with like-minded peers, and respected historians in the field of Australian political history. As part of their involvement in the program, our 2024 participants have contributed chapters to our upcoming book, Finding Menzies, a new generation's inspiration for foreign affairs, social policy and political thought. So in this episode, I'll be speaking to Orlando about his chapter on Australia and New Zealand, two sides of the same sea. Orlando, why did you choose this chapter?
Well, thank you so much for having me,
Or this
Georgina.
topic, I should say. You wrote a chapter on the topic.
Yeah, no, of course. Well, I'm just a student at Sydney Uni, and I've always been fascinated with the interwar years and sort of just post World War II. And AUKUS was signed recently between Australia, the UK, and the US, and I thought I'd try and trace that back to ANZUS with New Zealand. And I thought an interesting avenue might be to compare New Zealand and Australia and see why maybe New Zealand wasn't involved in AUKUS today and try and trace those roots back.
Yeah, well, of course, yes. New Zealand parts company from the ANZUS in the 1980s, doesn't it? But
It
let's rewind back to those heady
early
days of
days.
the 1940s and 50s when ANZUS was in preparation and then finally signed. What took place back then, Orlando, to set the stage for the signing of ANZUS between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States?
Well, you had a really interesting time. So obviously, the war, World War II, ended in 1945, and then I suppose geopolitics started to change and evolve. The rise of communism in the 50s, and because of that, and China, the US wanted to rearm Japan, and Australia, having had quite an experience with Japan in World War II, wanted a reassurance for the rearmament of Japan. And they saw an opportunity to create a deal with the US, a pact which became ANZUS with New Zealand. But Australia was probably the biggest proponent and had quite a lot of opposition. But you had a really interesting time breaking away from Britain, its traditional sort of power, and forming its own sort of foreign affairs and strategy.
Yes, of course, Australia was pretty disappointed by Britain's efforts to help it defend itself in the early stages of World War II. So the ANZUS becomes a sort of product of that and that deteriorating relationship. Tell me, what was the New Zealand attitude towards ANZUS? I know you've quoted the head of New Zealand's External Affairs Department in your chapter, Alistair McIntosh, saying that New Zealand never wanted the damn Pacific Pact in the first place. So the attitude was
Yeah,
quite different from Australia's.
it was quite intense, and that's what I find so interesting because you often think of, New Zealand and Australia like that, just
Mm.
slightly different accents. But they were surprising. They were much more tied to Britain than Australia was. And I think that stemmed from the fact that, as you said, Australia had a different history with the Japanese. They didn't have as much of a threat as Australia did in the war. Um, but Australia also, I think, wanted to create its own or pave its own way in foreign affairs. There's a good quote, I can't remember off the top of my head, but it was by Alistair McIntosh, and he says, New Zealand didn't share the same value as Australia in wanting to sort of carve its way in foreign affairs. It was happy to just continue its ties with England or Britain, whereas Australia wanted to try and create its own way, and that sort of came through with the US.
It's interesting because it's not the critics of Australia's foreign policy tend to paint Australia as having a foreign policy of dependency, and it's not an independent foreign policy. But that is quite striking for the foreign policy direction of Australia at that time to be quite prepared to depart from its traditional ally and, of course, former colonial power in Britain.
Mm. No, exactly. And it was a huge step. You can look into I mean, I think I quote it in the chapter, but after World War II, even the US, they said, consultation or post-war consultations with Australia won't happen in Canberra, they'll happen in Downing Street. So we still relied heavily on Britain. So it was a big step to try and break away from the UK and form this partnership with the US. And yeah, it was really huge. Sorry, I'm just mind blanking a little bit.
That's
Um,
okay. Tell me about New Zealand's strategic interests in the early 1950s. How did it sort of see its place in the world and its concerns?
I think it just relied heavily on the UK. Australia, as I said, was different because post World War II, it was let down by Britain. New Zealand wasn't. I mean, they weren't bombed as we were in Darwin. And I think Australia was really scared when they realized its traditional partner couldn't rely on it. So I think New Zealand didn't have that aspect. They didn't want to, well, I presume they didn't really want to be a leader in foreign policy, at least in the Pacific. They were happy to just, stand behind Britain. And I don't think they wanted to disrupt or displease the UK. Whereas Australia, I think was the opposite. It really did tread on Britain's toes when they said, "Look, we're gonna sign this pact with the US, and eventually New Zealand, would they tagged along, and we're gonna step on your toes." And Britain was like, "No, don't do that, please." But they did, and it was a huge thing. So I think New Zealand originally wanted to try and play it safe, but when they realized ANZUS could become an opportunity, they went for it with Australia.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting during World War II, New Zealand leaves its troops, doesn't it, in the
It does.
Mediterranean, while John Curtin, who's Prime Minister, then brings Australian troops home. So this sort of very different experiences during World War II, Australia directly under attack. As you say, the bombing of Darwin, we had the Japanese midget subs in Sydney
Mm,
Harbour. So there was a real sort of sense of Australia under threat.
yeah,
Whereas New Zealand, so, just that bit further away in the middle of the Tasman Sea.
yeah, just that
Yeah,
extra step. And it
yeah.
made such a big difference. And yeah, they didn't bring their troops back, and Australia, of course, did. And I think it did create a lot of anxiety or sort of tension between Australia and New Zealand, which you sort of, I suppose, wouldn't really think about if you just think back on history. You don't sort of generally think that. But yeah, there was a huge tension. Um,
Did you get the sense that there was a single event or something that changed New Zealand's mind on ANZUS and made it want to join the ANZUS when initially it was pretty lukewarm?
I think when they could, uh, probably when they could see that it was really coming together. Initially, the US just wanted to sign a declaration. They didn't want a formal treaty. And, eventually a treaty was being drafted up and discussed. And I think New Zealand said, well, if you can bring it about, we'll hop on board. So that sort of left Australia as the negotiator saying, well, we have the US, let's bring it all together. If we can, New Zealand will jump on board, and they did. They all came together, which was significant. But a big player, I think, would be Percy Spender. He was known as the architect of ANZUS, and I think he was a huge proponent of it in bringing the New Zealand and US representatives together.
Yeah. Did you get a sense that ANZUS wouldn't have happened without New Zealand? Was it really that important to have New Zealand there? Did the US sort
Um,
of need New Zealand to kind of, I don't know, round it out?
oh gosh, big statements. I don't like to think what history might have been, but probably not. I think, this was just Australia really wanting to find an ally and a partner that it could rely on. It realized it couldn't rely on Britain and it wanted the US. The reason ANZUS came about was they wanted to rearm Japan. Um, and to do that, the US needed New Zealand and Australian support. So I suppose in that sense, they would need New Zealand because they
Mm.
needed both support to rearm Japan in the face of communism. But yeah, it's a tough question. I think Australia was probably the biggest factor.
How did ANZUS evolve after it was signed from the New Zealand perspective? I mean, this is again, you know, the two countries have quite different experiences, don't they?
Yeah, no, they really do. So I suppose it was sort of stagnant for a while, and opportunities or events arose in which ANZUS came into play. One significant war, of course, would be Vietnam. Australia and New Zealand became involved there. Britain didn't, obviously. So I suppose that might be a byproduct of ANZUS. The UK wasn't part of ANZUS, and maybe that was a slight reason they didn't get involved. But New Zealand and Australia did. And then, of course, New Zealand left ANZUS in the 80s due to the nuclear, they were anti-nuclear, and didn't want American ships in their waters, nuclear ships in their waters, so they left. But with Australia, it continued on in 2001 with the terror attacks. I think John Howard formally invoked ANZUS to say, we'll stand by your side and support you in this time of threat and danger. And now we've led on to have AUKUS, which is a significant milestone. And interestingly, now the British are here and New Zealand's not. But yeah, they definitely diverged in significant ways later on.
I think it's interesting in your chapter how you explain how Britain tried to stymie ANZUS. They really did what they could to stop Australia and New Zealand signing the alliance pact with the United States.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. Sort of reading things and can see the banter and just the sort of tension and anger. And I think, um, yeah, Britain really tried to stop it. McIntosh, says they really tried to quote torpedo the whole thing, and sort of talk to the US and say, don't do this, and Australia. And they did push for the less influential presidential declaration rather than a treaty. But of course the treaty pulled through and we got there. But it is interesting, Australia and Britain were so close, but when it came to this, swords were drawn a little bit.
Yeah. Do you think ANZUS? I mean, so Britain eventually withdraws after the Suez Crisis, withdraws from east of Suez and,
Mm.
withdraws all its troops. And this is a real blow for Robert Menzies and Australia. And, there's a real sense that Britain is just abandoning the Commonwealth and the obviously the empire's over. But I mean, is ANZUS sort of contributing to Britain's sort of disengagement with the Pacific, do you think, and the region?
I think so. I think and Australia realized Britain's imperial power overseas was starting to diminish, and I think it did add to it, definitely. And it's a tough thing because obviously Menzies was very pro-Britain, British to the bootstraps, but he did realize, I think, that although we're a British colony and also sorry Commonwealth, uh, we needed to find a partner that was in the end had a stronger arm than Britain could provide, and that was the US.
What are your reflections then with the development of AUKUS on how Britain is now back in the fold?
I think it's so interesting, and I'm a huge Anglophile, so I think it's great. But I think it shows that we've shifted from a Commonwealth outpost to actually um, to doing business with Britain, less as a protectorate and more as, an active, independent partner. Whereas before ANZUS and in World War II, we were less so independent and more so really leaning on Britain to help us out. Whereas now, Britain, the US, and Australia were all very strong, independent powers that can help each other out. But I think we're less so leaning on Britain, and it's a sign of that.
And where does this leave New Zealand then, do you think?
Oh, um, I don't know. I think they could, I think there's always a possibility that they could jump back into the fold. But of course, they were very anti-nuclear, and that's a big thing with the UK and the US and now Australia. But I think it's really on their terms. If they would, I'm sure they'd be welcomed with open arms. But it's sort of their decision.
Mm.
All the
Well,
merrier.
Orlando, thank you so much for writing this chapter. I think it's a really important contribution to the new book, and thank you for participating in the Menzies Early Career Network.
Georgina, thank you so much for having me, and it was an absolute pleasure. So thank you.
Right.